Everyone, this is Michelle the storyteller, and today I'm going to be telling some Japanese fairy tales. So for anyone who hasn't seen me do fairy tales before, I promise I actually started out as a children's performer, so it'll be okay. I absolutely promise. Now with this, whenever I tell fairy tales, I like them to kind of be interactive. This is the first time I'm having to do them virtually, so I'm going to try to look down sometimes at my computer to see if any of you are commenting, if you're saying anything. So just let me know. I also know that right now I have a super cute niece watching this, so I'm excited that she gets to see me do this, even if it's not in person. So whenever you think about fairy tales, what is it that you like about fairy tales? Is there anything that you remember with them? So if you think so, make sure you write it down in the comments because I like going back to those things and kind of bringing those up later on. So just think about what you liked about fairy tales as a kid. What I personally liked was it was always something new. It was an adventure. And it was something that I'd never really thought of before. I didn't really think about animals talking. I didn't think about supernatural beings and all the magic that was in the world. And to me, that was very special because it's not something you ever get to see, at least in my reality. Oh, I wish it was. But in fairy tales, anything can happen. Anyone can happen. And something else that's really special with fairy tales, kind of like what I mentioned just a second ago, whenever I was talking, I think it might have been before the recording. But something that's really special about fairy tales is they tell you a lot about people. So, for instance, it tells you what they value, what they like, what they want to do. So, it's really important to think about fairy tales and then what they can teach us about people. But enough about that. I'm going to just start telling you some of these fairy tales. So with this, I want you to think about what it was like whenever you were a little kid and you heard the word once upon a time. So whenever I say that, I want you to remember what it was like to be a little kid getting tucked into bed and hearing those words and how magical they were. Can I get a feeling? Okay, so let's try this. We're going to have a practice for this. I'm going to say once upon a time and you're going to have the reaction, okay? Once upon a time. Okay, I know for a fact that most of you didn't do it, but just try to keep that feeling in your heart. Try to remember what it was like. And I promise it's a lot more fun if you do that while you're going along with this. So, once upon a time, there was an old man and an old woman. They were very in love. They were very kind to one another. But no matter how hard they tried in their life, they'd never been able to have a child of their own. And even though they worked very hard all their lives, they didn't really have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of anything. They had a tiny house, hardwood floors that they were grateful for. They were at least solid. They had a little bit of food. But other than that, they really had the clothes on their back. But they had one thing they were very rich in. They had kind hearts. They loved one another immensely. And on a certain day, the day before the new year, they decided that something that they would like to have was they would like to have rice cakes to help celebrate. So something that they had done is they had been working on creating these straw hats. They put these together with straw that the old man had gone up into the mountains and cut, and they were beautifully designed. So the day before New Year, the old man walked across fields, across the snow, and he went into town to try to sell the hats. Well, with this, it was a hard day to try to sell anything. Everyone was busy and everyone wanted the same thing they wanted. Everyone wanted rice cakes. Sadly, that meant everyone kept passing by him and no one wanted the hats. So the hours slipped by, the daylight started slipping by, and eventually people were all gone. And the man had 6 hats and the hat on his head. At the end of the day, he still had 6 hats and the hat on his head. So he was very sad and very forlorn because he knew he had to go back and tell his wife he didn't have the rice cakes. So he packed up, he walked back across the snow, across the fields, and during this time the snow started coming down again. Well, on his walk back, he noticed 7 little Jizo statues. Now, for those of you who don't know what a statue is as far as a Jizo statue, they're little guardian statues that help protect people, especially children. But something he noticed was as the snow was falling, it was covering their heads. Well, that just wouldn't do. So he went over, he dusted off their heads, and he began taking the hats, and he began putting them on. Now, here's the part where I'm going to teach you a little bit of something. We're going to count in Japanese. So I'm going to say it, and then you're going to follow along, okay? Let's try it. Ichi, ni, san, yon, go, roku, nana. Congratulations, you just counted to 7 in Japanese. I'm so proud of you. Well, as the man went by, he dusted off each of the statues and he began putting the hats on one by one by one. But whenever he got to the final one, he realized he'd only brought 6 hats, but it seemed wrong to leave one without a hat while the others did. So even though it was cold and even though it was snowing, the old man took the hat off of his own head and put it on that statue. Well, as he walked home, he was quite cold, but he was at least happy to know that even if he couldn't have his rice cakes, he'd been able to help someone, even if it was a statue. Whenever he got home, he told his wife, and he was a little bit worried about what she would think. But all she did whenever he told her was she smiled, she kissed him, and she hugged him and said, "I'm so proud of you. This is the best New Year's ever." Well, whenever they went to sleep that night, they both cuddled up by the fire, but then they began hearing strange sounds outside. They weren't sure what it was at first. It sounded like heavy foot drops. But those weren't quite feet. Those always pick up and step again. You hear crunch, crunch, crunch. But this was a constant. At first they were scared, but the more they listened, the calmer they became. Something was strange, but not too strange. And then all of a sudden they heard a on the door. No one ever came to visit them. Who was it? Well, they got up, they opened the door, and what did they see outside? They saw a huge pile of rice cakes. They saw millet. They saw fish. It was a feast, a New Year's feast. And all they saw leading up and then away were 7 tracks, almost like a rock had rolled. Well, at first they became curious where that could be, but then they looked up on the hill and they saw all 7 statues looking down on them, smiling. And that's how they were able to have their New Year's feast. And that's how the Jizo statues got their hats. So with this kind of story, what do you learn? What do you think about it? What's so important about this? Well, you can write it in, of course, on Facebook Live. But something that I always think that you get from this kind of story is you get what it's like to help and take care of others. Whenever you're kind to others, they're kind to you too. Another thing that's important is the old man and the old woman, they didn't have a lot, but they had kindness. And whenever you have kindness, that goes a very long way. So just always try to keep that. Keeping a kind heart gives you a much better life. So, did you like that story? Well, I hope so, because I have another one for you. This one is called the Salt Mortar. So, have you ever seen a mortar? Okay, chances are you probably haven't. But what this thing is this giant stone thing that has a bottom stone part and a top stone part. And what you can do is you can grab a handle and grind the top stone across the bottom stone to help flatten things out and help grind them. So with this, that's important to know. You'll know why in just a second. So once upon a time, okay, maybe two more of you did it this time, but I will take that as a win. So once upon a time, there were two brothers. One brother inherited the entire family fortune. He was the oldest brother. He received everything he could have ever wanted from the family. However, he was alone. He didn't want to share anything that he had, so he kicked out his younger brother, and he never took a wife. The younger brother built his own house close by so he could try to be close to his family, but he also took a wife who he loved dearly. Well, with that, the younger brother didn't really have anything, so whenever it came time for a holiday, he wanted to have some rice to offer to the gods. Him and his wife had always been very religious and very observant of the holidays, but that year had been very difficult for them. So the younger brother went to his older brother and asked if he could just have a handful of rice. His older brother made fun of him. Why are you asking for rice? You're a grown man. How can you not have this already yourself? Get out of my house. Not very kind, is it? Well, the younger brother went away, and he began walking and walking, but eventually he found himself out in the mountains. Somehow you always end up in the mountains in these stories. Well, as he was walking a mountain path trying to think of what to do, what could he possibly offer the gods instead of rice, he found an old man with a very, very large sack. The man looked very tired and he was having difficulty carrying everything. So the kind younger brother offered to help carry it for him. Where are you going? Can I help? Well, the man let him know that he was going into town, but he'd gotten too tired and he wasn't able to carry it any further. So the younger brother offered to help carry it for him instead. So even though he had gone out there for a different reason, he decided that the best thing he could do to honor the gods and to honor his own heart was to help someone else. So he picked up the heavy bag, and even though it weighed him down, he kept carrying it further and further along. He went all the way into town, and whenever he got there, he sat down the sack outside the man's house and said, "Have a wonderful day." Well, the man was so impressed with the younger brother that he pulled out some millet and he handed it to him. And he said, "If you go to the shrine on the outskirts of town and you go behind the shrine, you'll find a hole. Crawl down the hole and give this millet to the tiny people who live there. If you do that and they offer you a gift, make sure you ask for the mortar." Well, the younger brother had never heard of anything like this, and even though he'd been to that shrine several times, he'd certainly never seen anything like that. But why not? What did he have to lose? He didn't even know why he needed a mortar, but clearly this man thought he did, so not try. Well, with this, he went out, he took the millet, he found the shrine, and as he looked around, he saw that there was a tiny little path he'd never noticed. Certainly too small for people, but a tiny path. Maybe it was a fox? Well, anyways, he had something to try. So he went behind the shrine, and as he looked along the path, he found it go into some bushes. He pushed the bushes aside and he looked in, and sure enough, there was a large hole, large enough for even him to crawl into. So, thinking only of the old man's words, he crawled down the hole. And whenever he finally got so deep that he was afraid he may never get out, he began to hear voices. What was that? So he crawled further and further in, and then he saw an entire group of little people trying to move straw. Well, they were struggling. They were little, so they weren't quite as strong as what we're used to. So even trying to lift one strand of straw was too much for them. They had to work as groups, but even then they were still falling down. So the man smiled. He looked at them and said, "Can I help?" And they were too shocked to say anything. They'd never seen such a giant in their own home. But Giant didn't wait for an answer. The younger brother reached down and he began to pick up the straw and began to put it in the pile where they were trying to put it. And he did this over and over and over until the pile was full. They looked up at him and they couldn't believe it. They thanked him and they asked him who he was, where he was from. But then one of them smelled the millet. "Is that millet you have? Can I have it? Can we have it?" Well, the man was ready to agree. He had a feeling that now the old man had known what he was talking about. And they said, "Can we give you a gift for the millet? We'll trade. We'll trade." Next thing you knew, they brought out an entire pile of gold. Now, don't ask me how they were able to move the gold and not the millet. It's a fairy tale. And they asked him, "Would you like the gold for the millet?" "No, I'm afraid that I don't need any gold." Next, they brought out an entire pile of jade. "Would you like this jade for the millet?" "No, I'm afraid that I don't need any jade. But I do need a mortar." Well, that surprised them. They talked back and forth. To them, the mortar was something that was definitely a treasure, but millet was a delicacy. They talked among themselves and they decided, yes, they would give him the mortar, but they definitely needed that millet. Well, they traded, and the younger brother took the mortar and he crawled up the hole the way he had come. But whenever he got home, he began trying to figure out how to use it. But something that he'd heard from the little people before he left was a little trick. Whenever he had the mortar, while he was using it, while he was grinding left, if he would say whatever he would want, it would keep coming out of the mortar until he was ready to be done, in which case he should always turn it right. That would stop it. Well, the man was kind of curious, and whenever he told his wife, she was equally as curious. So they asked for what they'd wanted for the god. They asked for rice. "Mortar, mortar, please give me rice." And they began grinding it left. And all of a sudden, rice began spilling out of the sides of the mortar, completely filling the living room before the man remembered, "Oh, turn it right." And then it stopped. Well, that was fantastic. First of all, they had enough for the gods, but even enough for themselves. They hadn't eaten so well in quite a while. But then they played with it a little bit more. I wonder if it'll give us anything else. "Well, and mortar, mortar, please give me gold." And out of the side of the mortar came just piles of gold. They tried this with several different things, and each and every time the mortar delivered. But that's just part of the story. So, with this, the man and his wife became very rich. They were able to build a wonderful house, but they were also very kind. They shared with everyone, except for the older brother, who was always too proud to accept. But he was also very upset that suddenly his younger brother was becoming more and more successful than him. How did he have so much while the successful older brother had nothing? The brother had to find out. And his chance came one day whenever they found out that they were going to have a party. See, the younger man and his wife liked sharing with people. And with that, they decided to have a party to be able to share all that they had with all their friends. So they brought them over. They had a wonderful party, food that people had never even been able to taste because they couldn't afford it. They gave them all gifts, and it was a lovely time. But then the younger brother realized halfway through that they'd forgotten to have treats for everyone to take home. So he quickly snuck out of the party and went to a side room. And his older brother saw this as a chance. He followed him, walked behind him, and snuck a peek around the door to watch what his younger brother was doing. There he saw his younger brother saying, "Mortar, mortar, please give me snacks." And as he began grinding it, snacks began popping out. And suddenly the older brother knew what had happened and he ran away because he had a plan he took into action that very night. That night, while the kind younger brother and his wife slept, the older brother snuck into the house and he stole the mortar. He decided that he was going to be even richer. His brother hadn't thought big enough. He knew exactly what to do with a mortar like that. So instead of going back to his old home, he got onto a boat and began going towards a larger town. He decided that being a big fish in a little pond was enough for him. That little town was suddenly beneath him. He was going to be rich and famous in Kyoto. So as he went through, he was riding along the pond. Now he brought some of those snacks that his brother had sent home with him, and he was snacking on those. But then he began to think that he wanted more to eat. Well, he had something with him. It was just a little bit of fish, but it wasn't quite tasty enough. So as he was going along on this boat, he had an idea, maybe a little bit of salt. So he took the mortar and he said, "Mortar, mortar, please give me salt." And he began to grind it left. Well, salt began coming out, but then it wouldn't stop. It kept filling the boat and filling the boat until eventually the man had to jump out of the boat because it was sinking with the weight of the salt. You see, what the brother hadn't realized was he hadn't watched long enough to figure out how to make it stop. Pleading with it, begging with it did nothing. He didn't know to turn the mortar right. While the boat sunk, the man eventually washed into another town and he was too ashamed to go back home. And now, even to this day, that mortar is still spilling out salt. And that's why there's some areas where you can go into, like the oceans, that are still salt water, because to this day, no one's turned off the mortar. So, what do you learn with this kind of story? What are some things that you get out of that? Well, there's definitely a few lessons to think of. First of all, is it good to be greedy? No, it's bad to be greedy. Don't do that. So, what happened with this? What went wrong? Well, the older brother decided he wanted to steal what his brother had. So he took it. And did it lead to good things? No. It led to him losing everything. It also led to some really salty seas. But for the younger brother, what did we learn from him? Was he a good guy? Yeah, he was. Was he sweet to other people? You got that right. He definitely was. So whenever you're kind and sincere, good things come to you. Whenever you help people without expecting it, sometimes you get that in return. So, what we learned from these two brothers is what happens depending on the kind of person you are. So, are you a good person or are you a bad person? Well, you're not really either, but sometimes what you do makes things get treated a little bit different. So, whenever you're going out into the world, make sure you're doing good and not doing bad, at least when you can. Okay, so that's that story. Next, I'm going to tell you the story about the Rat Sutra. Now, I know a lot of you don't like rats. I know that I personally am not the biggest fan, but I promise this is a pretty good story. So, once upon a time, you're getting better at it. Once upon a time, there was a woman who lived alone in a shack. She lived out in the middle of the woods, far away from anywhere else. And she was alone, but she hadn't always been. She had once had her husband living there too, and they were very happy together. But he had gotten sick and he had died. So she went on living there, happy and content with all of her memories of him, with all of their memories of being together. And every day before going out to work the fields, she would say a little prayer for him and a little shrine that she had built in the house. Now, unfortunately, she didn't know any sutras. She didn't know anything that she could chant to try to ease her husband's afterlife. But she did have the idea of at least trying. So she'd say a little prayer, she would go work. She would come home and eat, and then right before bed, she'd say another prayer and go to sleep. Well, she was very kind and sincere as well. So one day, whenever she was out working the fields and she saw a young monk walking along, she thought nothing of it whenever he asked if he could come to her house because he had nowhere to stay. You see, he was supposedly a traveling monk, and he was just going through on a search and adventure of truth and just needed somewhere to go. Well, she obviously said yes, so he came to the house, but what she didn't know was that he was not telling the truth. He wasn't a young monk. Actually, he was just a beggar who had stolen some clothes. But he found it was much easier to get people's help whenever he tried to dress as a monk rather than dressing as himself. So that night, she fed him, she let him eat first, she let him bathe first. She made sure that everything he could need was there. But before he started to go to bed, she asked him, "Mr. Monk, can you please do me just one favor? Don't have to if you don't want, but please, just one thing. I miss my husband, and I worry about him. Can you just teach me one sutra that I can say for him at night and in the morning, just to help ease his pain, to help ease him in the afterlife until I get to join him?" Well, she was so sad and she cried so hard that the monk, or at least the fake monk, of course agreed. But the problem was, you see, he didn't know any sutras either, but he was pretty good at making things up. So he went in front of the tiny little shrine the woman had built, and he put his hands together. And she stood behind him and copied him, and he told her to say everything that he said exactly as he said it. And she agreed. So he began trying to think of what sounded right. And then he began to look around. See, just as he began to say his chant, he noticed a rat on the floor. And as he was watching the rat, he decided to try to chant whatever the rat was doing. After all, she didn't know any better. So he put his hands together and said, "Chim chum char." Rat and scuttle on the floor. Just as he said that, the rat scuttled across. Chim chim char, peek into the door. As he said that, he was watching the rat look outside. Chim chim char, tell us all your tale. Just as the rat began making a little sound. Chim chim char, back from where you hail. And as he said that, the rat went back into its little hole. And the woman answered and repeated everything. Chim chim char, scuttle on the floor. Chim chim char, peek into the door. Chim chim char, tell us all your tale. Chim chim char, back from where you hail. She repeated everything that he said. And he was very happy with himself. He made sure that she was smiling, and he went to bed. The next day he left thinking nothing of it, and went on with his life. A year later, that same beggar returns, only now he wasn't a beggar anymore. He was a thief. He hadn't remembered the house, it had been so long. So as he began to approach the house, he was very surprised whenever, just as he began to walk towards the house, he heard scuttle on the floor. And then just as he began to look into the door, he heard peek into the door. What kind of witch was this? Could she hear everything going on? What kind of woman could do that? And then he heard Chim Chim Char, tell us all your tale, just as he began to speak and ask himself that. Well, he was so scared that he began running away, and that's just whenever he heard Chim Chim Char, back from where you hail. Well, the man was several miles away whenever he suddenly remembered. Not too long ago, he'd said those same words to someone else. And he realized that even a year later, that woman was still reciting the sutra that he'd made up. But she didn't know that. She thought it was real. And suddenly, he began to become sad. His heart felt heavy. You see, he had never thought about taking advantage of others. He'd never thought about hurting anyone. But whenever he heard her still saying that every night for her husband, it made him realize he had done something wrong. So he made a decision. He decided he was going to become a monk for real. So several years later, that same man, now a decent, upstanding monk with long white whiskers, came up and knocked on the woman's door. She was so surprised to see such a grand monk, and automatically she recognized him. She was so proud and happy for him for all that he had accomplished. After all, he'd gone from being very poor and very destitute to suddenly being covered in gold. Suddenly she realized he had to have done something right. Well, the man told her, I once did something wrong, and I've come to fix it. I have come to teach you a sutra. Now, the woman didn't know what he had done wrong, but she was very happy to have a new sutra to be able to tell her husband. So she listened, she recited it, she memorized it, and after the monk was sure that she had the sutra correct, he left. But what he didn't know is each night after reciting the new sutra, she would always finish with Chim Chim Char. So this is the story about the Rat Sutra. So the rat's involved, but the real rat, was it the rat or was it someone else? Think about it. Who do you think the rat was? Hmm? It was the man. The beggar turned thief turned monk. He was the monk and he was the rat. But he was able to change things around. So he had done something bad before, but if you do one bad thing, does that make you a bad person? What do you think? No, it doesn't. It just means that you've done something wrong, you've made a mistake. What matters is what you do afterward. And that man decided that he was going to make it better. He was going to make it up for that woman. So he had apologized and he taught her something new. Does that mean he's still a bad man? No. It just means that he did something bad. But then he did something good. So seems to me like since he kept living that path, he ended up being a good guy in the end. So with that, we get to learn a little bit about him and how he's doing. So I'm going to tell another story. I'm going to tell you the story of the Lord Bag of Rice. This one's actually kind of an adventure story too, though, so you get to see a little bit of fighting, or at least hear about it and imagine it in your head. Are you ready? Okay, we're going to try this again. Remember how you're supposed to react, okay? Think about it. Once upon a time. You guys are getting better. Once upon a time, there was a warrior, and his name was Fujiwara. Fujiwara had a restless spirit. He didn't have anything to fight. He didn't have anything to do, but he was so used to being busy that he had to go out in search of adventure. So he left his home and began walking aimlessly with nothing except for his bow and arrows and a little bit of food to try to keep him company as he looked for adventure. He knew it was out there somewhere. He just had to find it. Well, as he went along, he realized there wasn't really that much to do until one day, as he was walking across a bridge, he saw something horrific. In front of him, wrapped all across the bridge and taking up all the space on the bridge, was a giant sea serpent. It was a gigantic dragon. And as the dragon was there, he saw that while its eyes were closed, thought it might be sleeping, fire still came from the nostrils, and its whiskers twitched every now and then. As he heard this, began to wonder, even with the fire, even with the serpent, could he get across the bridge? Well, that would be an adventure in its own right. After all, if he turned around, he didn't know another place he could cross the water. So if it was asleep, and maybe he could get across. So he began very softly and very delicately trying to step around the serpent. He'd step, wait, step, wait. And he'd keep trying to jump from place to place so as to not step on the dragon. Until, just as he was getting ready to take another step forward, the serpent disappeared beneath his feet. He didn't see it anywhere. Where was it? Until he turned around, and behind him he saw a man. But it wasn't just any man. He had a very long beard that was turquoise, and his hair, turquoise as well, was flowing all the way down into the water with its length. On the head of the man, he noticed a crown. Not the kind of crown he was used to. It was a crown of shells. What kind of crown could that be? And the man's clothes were of most delicate silk, but there was something different about them. They were completely covered in pearls. As the warrior, Fujiwara, looked at the man, he couldn't help but ask, "Are you the serpent?" The man agreed and informed him that he wasn't just a serpent. He was, in fact, the Dragon King, and the water the man was crossing was his own home. Now, Fujiwara was curious why a Dragon King would want to talk to him, but time to find out. So he asked the man, "Is there something you need?" The Dragon King waited no further. He told Fujiwara that he had been sitting on that bridge for days, waiting for someone brave enough to try to walk across. But everyone else had turned around until there was Fujiwara. And he said that he had been in search of a grand warrior, a strong fighter, to try to help him and his family. You see, the Dragon King was in trouble. He had his entire family down in the castle below with him. He had his children, he had his grandchildren, he had everyone who took care of him, but someone was going after them. Up on the mountains, there was apparently a gigantic centipede that every single night would come down to the Dragon King's palace and steal someone away. Well, the Dragon King was getting very sad and very lonely. He worried that eventually he would have no one there with him. It had been coming for weeks, and he was very scared that eventually his last grandchild, his last child, his last retainer, and eventually even himself would be gone and there'd be nothing left. So he begged Fujiwara to do something to fight the centipede. And Fujiwara thought nothing of it. He agreed almost immediately. And the Dragon King was so happy that he himself took Fujiwara down to the dragon castle below. Now, keep in mind, this is magic, so he was able to breathe and move around okay, but there he saw things he'd never seen before. Instead of servants like he was used to seeing, all the servants were fish. There were goldfish, there were carp, there were minnows, all the different kinds. And then even the people, the children of the Dragon King, the grandchildren of the Dragon King, some of the servants, all of them looked completely different from what he was ever used to. They were all beautiful and all extraordinarily kind. That night, they gave Fujiwara a feast, and he was so pleased as he watched them dance before him. After all, you've never really seen a dance until you've seen a sea dance. But then the sound came. It was the sound of the centipede coming. Well, Fujiwara knew exactly what he had to do. The Dragon King looked up. He parted the waters, and Fujiwara was able to see a gigantic centipede wrapped 5 times around a mountain. It was huge, bigger than anything he'd ever seen. As a matter of fact, it made the Dragon King seem very small in comparison. What could he do? He had a plan, but not for 5 times around a mountain plan. But he decided he was going to do his best. So he reached into his quiver to pull out an arrow. He had only 3 arrows left. So He put it into string, he pulled it back and he let it go. But even though it hit the centipede right in the middle of the head, it bounced off. All this time, the centipede's rushing closer and closer and closer. Fujiwara reached back, once again pulled out another one. This time he aimed for the eye. He hit it, but once again the arrow bounced off. The centipede was completely unhurt. And just as the centipede was nearing the water and about to crawl in, Fujiwara remembered something that he'd heard once from his mother. She'd told him that centipedes were allergic to human saliva. Ugh, think about that. So Fujiwara reached back, took out an arrow, and put it in his mouth before pulling it out. Notched his arrow, let it fly, and hit the centipede right between the eyes, only this time it worked, and the centipede was instantly killed. But it was a strange thing because as the centipede disappeared, it left behind 3 gifts. 3 gifts, the Dragon King said, were Fujiwara's to keep. It left a bag of rice, a roll of silk, and a cooking pot. For anyone who's played video games, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Well, Fujiwara had originally offered these gifts to the Dragon King, but the Dragon King refused, saying that they were in fact his to keep because he was the one who had defeated the centipede. And he decided that one gift he could give Fujiwara was a new name to show his conquering spirit. He renamed him Tawara. So now, Tawara, with these 3 gifts, returned home. After all, he'd finally had an adventure. But what he found was no matter how much he used the bag of rice, it never emptied. He would pour it and pour it and pour it, but no matter what, there was always more rice. And with that roll of silk, no matter how much he cut, the roll never became shorter. It just kept magically growing longer and longer, it seemed. And the pot, no matter what you cooked in it, always came out deliciously made and perfect. Now with this, with the rice, with the silk, Tawara became famous. As a matter of fact, he became very rich. Once again, the gift of a name, the gift of the defeat. So with this, the emperor became very jealous after hearing about Tawara's good wealth, especially that bag of rice. The emperor became convinced that if he had that bag of rice, he would be even more powerful than ever. So he went and asked Tawara if he could have the bag of rice. Tawara tried to say no, but the emperor was very powerful, so he had no choice but to relinquish it. So in exchange for a never-ending bag of rice, the emperor gave him 100 bags of rice. Now, Tawara was upset about this, but he realized that it was okay for things to change, and he still had 2 gifts left. But he did ask the emperor if ever he became bored with it to return the bag to him, and the emperor agreed. Well, for quite some time the emperor played with his new toy. He would often go into the kitchen himself and empty the rice. But one day, it was gone. See, what the emperor hadn't realized was whenever he had given Tawara 100 bags of rice, that suddenly became all that that bag of rice could give. He'd curse, he'd try to figure out what to do, but no matter what, the bag would no longer give rice. So thinking nothing of it, he decided that he would at least keep good on his word, and he sent the bag back to Tawara. And no sooner had Tawara picked up the bag and began to tilt it than the rice began to pour out again. You see, Tawara was the only one who could make it a bottomless bag of rice. Why? Because it was his treasure. So this is the story of Lord Bag of Rice. So what do you get from that story? What did you think about the dragon? Was it a good dragon? What about the centipede? It was pretty scary, wasn't it? But what did we think about Fujiwara, or Tawara, whichever one you want to call him? He's a pretty good guy. He helped people without ever considering if it was going to be anything for him. He didn't fight the emperor about something because he realized that things are meant to be left go of if they need to. He was grateful for what he had, not for what he'd lost. And because of that, he was even more grateful when it came back again. Pretty good guy, I think. So, with this, I don't think I've really got time for another story. Sorry, my stories are kind of long and lengthy. So, if you like this story, I'm glad you did. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comments. You can also contact me on my Facebook page. I do have a Michelle the Storyteller Facebook page that you can just look up. I think that there's also a link on the website somewhere as far as for Visioncon. But thank you so much for tuning in to watch, and I hope you had fun. And just remember, just because you grow up doesn't mean that the fairy tales have to go away. They just change a little bit.
Ooh,